Hi everyone, it's Taz, and I'm excited to share my final presentation for the POL 319 with you guys. So let's get started. I'm going to share my screen. And here we go. Share. All right, so my research topic from this paper is the intersectionality of race and culture for women of color within the legal profession. Soon you'll see what my research question is. So I'm going to play from current slide. So the introduction, inclusive measures taken by law firms and law school has given a false notion of equal treatment for all women within the legal profession. So the 1919 Sex Disqualification Act gave women the chance to enter the legal profession. But here we are 101 years later, and a new issue is facing among us, which is the inclusion and treatment of women of color within the legal profession. The struggles faced by women of color is a complete separate issue compared to struggles faced by white women in the legal profession. Gender bias within the legal profession is still apparent today due to a higher percentage of men being accepted into law school, and female faculty within these schools are more susceptible to harsher critique in evaluations, which impacts retention, promotion, salary, and even tenure. The number of female students and faculty can directly be correlated to those who end up practicing and staying in law. As a result, it's important to address this disparity so the legal profession can be seen as more welcoming for all women and all races and culture. This includes individuals on any end of the gender or sexuality spectrum. I'll be addressing disparities faced by women of color in the law school process, workplace, and those who go on to practice in higher courts and or become judges. In my research paper, I'll be highlighting the discrimination that women of color face within the legal profession and the difficulty in gaining respect along with achieving steady career growth compared to their white counterparts. My research question would be, how do women of color face gender bias within the legal profession? So truthfully, I feel this topic is important since there's discourse every day surrounding criminal justice reform and protests on equitable representation for all defendants, right? I feel that task is not achievable until the individuals that represent said defendants are not a representation of the diversity that the United States prides itself on, right? Women of color's voices needs to be heard and they should be deemed worthy enough. So in my literature review, I divided it into subsections, and this particular article fell under the gender bias in the legal profession section. So the author, Kimberly Jade Norwood, is a Black woman who's a professor of law at Washington University. In this piece, she addressed how, there has been a significant amount of female students and faculty improvement compared to when she entered in 1990. And the essay addresses the intersectionality of race and gender within the legal profession. In regards to the gender bias, data showed that female students are treated differently from male students, particularly white male students. And this is going back to how it's a different issue of white attorneys and what person of color attorney struggles within the law firm. In regards to racial biases, data from the Law 360 showed that firms seem to spend their diversity capital on Asian attorneys at the expense of Black attorneys. This shows that there's a preferential treatment within certain groups of color and how there's internal issues within the person of color community amidst issues with their white counterparts. So an article by Eli Ward addresses the toxic work nature and how that directly affects the improvement in economic and career growth for women of color, right? So this review addresses the ideological transformation of law firms from a competitive meritocracy to hyper-competitive ideology. I know that's a lot of words, so let me break it down. A competitive meritocracy is an emphasis on objective standards of excellence, meaning, you show some sense of, you perform professional judgment and you sustain a work-life balance, where the hyper-competitive ideology puts more of an emphasis on 24/7 client-centered representation, the maximum profit within these firms, and that directly affects the career growth for women and women of color within the field, because of the fact that there's already a large, significant less number of women of color within these executive positions. The no problem approach, which is addressed within the study, is the approach that once more women into the legal profession, then there will be more women partners in the law firm. That's not the case because this false idea creates these gender stereotypes, and that women attorneys face these issues within the firms that limit their chances to move up the ranks. So this kind of work environment directly helps men go up in the ranks, but not women. So this is another section of my lit review, which is Women of Color Within the Law. And this is by Ilya Lerma. And the author's analysis of women of color in the law is based directly off an American Bar Association report. And the findings had shown that women who hold executive or chair positions within law firms get there at the expense of other women fighting for that same position. So this goes back to, right, the Norwood article on how, their diversity capital is spent on Asian attorneys, but not Black attorneys, right? So all of these my lit review sources are all interconnected in some way. Instead of succeeding together, there's a divide placed between women of color attorneys in order to incite competition. There's no long-term growth or solutions that give women of color an incentive to stay in a particular firm or practice. So another article by Ben Edwards, it was an article published in June 2020, and I feel like that's very important to address because that just shows the prevalence of this issue and how it is still apparent today. And the number of Black, Asian, Latina, and multiracial women partners at U.S. law firms has remained stuck below 3.5% for the past 2 decades. And you'll see in one of my interviews how that's still prevalent today. According to a report by the American Bar Association, this article addressed a new study that conducted in-depth interviews that argued that the legal profession is not as inclusive as it claims to be. This article addresses the issue of women of color having to work twice as much to get half as far, right? This is a saying that I think as women of color and person of color, you hear every day. You got to work twice as much to get half as far, and any mistakes that you make will be used against you. It remains true that women of color have to rebuke any stereotypes that other partners may have about them. One survey respondent said that they have to continuously deal with assumptions of inferiority, intellectual or otherwise, and constantly having to prove themselves no matter how senior, disqualified, or experienced I am in something my white male peers do not have to do. It is psychologically exhausting. So another article, will be my last, is a original study, a survey conducted by 3 authors of about 2,000 attorneys on their perceptions of contrasting treatment based on an individual's gender, race, and age. The study began by addressing prior research on bias and stereotypes, and then focused on women of color's experiences within the legal profession. In the survey, they asked attorneys questions on the type of practice, firm sizes, and issue areas that characterize their practice. The result of the survey showed that female attorneys report higher levels of unfair treatment based on race, occasionally or often, while less than fourth, which is 23%, of minority males report disparate treatment based on race and the same frequency. So my research met this for my paper. So unfortunately, due to COVID-19, I will not be having directly access to women of color attorneys. So as a result, for my primary sources, I will be analyzing speeches and interviews. And I'm glad I found such great speeches and interviews because they directly correlate to the findings from the secondary research and just add on to it. So this will be an explanatory study because I will be highlighting the ways women of color face gender bias within the legal profession. So 3 primary sources that I will be analyzing is an interview by Laurel Bellows, the past president of the American Bar Association's Commission on Women in the Profession, about a report on being a woman of color in the profession. Side note, Laurel Bellows is a white woman, so a lot of her responses was great to me. It showed a sense of accountability. A speech by then appellate court judge, well, now is Associate Supreme Court Judge Sonia Sotomayor. And this was a speech that she did at the Mario G. Elmo's memorial lecture in 2001. And then an interview of past American Bar Association President of Paulette Brown, which is a Black attorney, in 2016, and was the president in 2016 of the ABA. So in the Laurel Bellows interview, throughout the interview, she addressed the multicultural, racial, and gender barriers faced when it comes to being a woman of color within the profession. Some of her quotes were, "It's a difficult thing for white women lawyers to realize," says Laura Bellows. "They're being told that they discriminate as much as men. It's not something you want to believe about yourself." And this is going back to my introduction, where I address how the issues faced by women of color attorneys and white women attorneys is completely different, right? Going from the work nature to pay to working themselves up the grand, steady career growth, the amount of time they stay in these practices. The combination of being an attorney of color and a woman is a double negative in the legal marketplace, regardless of the type of practice or geographic region involved. Multicultural women lawyers believe they are ghettoized into certain areas of the law, and other options are closed or implicitly unavailable. And this is going back to the intersectionality of race and culture, and how an Asian American woman might by culture have been trained to be less aggressive. A Latina might by culture have been taught to respect her elders and might not question the advice being given by an older white male. So for honorary Sonia Sotomayor, Justice Sotomayor, she was the first Latina nominated to sit on a federal appellate court. So some of the excerpts from her speech, which I really shortened because in my paper it's more lengthy, but in some of her excerpts I'm going to read it right now. Many of us struggle with this tension and attempt to maintain and promote our culture and ethnic identities in a society that is often ambivalent about how to deal with its differences. So in the beginning of her speech, she was very set on addressing being a Puerto Rican from New York and how that culture has really shaped her to who she is. And it doesn't necessarily mean being Latina has to be speaking Spanish or the stereotypes around being a Latina. It's the culture that really shaped her. And when she finished law school in 1979, there was no woman judges in the Supreme Court or the highest court of the home state, which is New York. She was originally raised in the Bronx. And I wonder whether by ignoring our differences as women or men of color, we do a disservice both to the law and society. So in her speech, she addressed how another judge had fear of, focusing on the race and culture of a judge, and that would hinder their ability to judge fairly. Instead, Justice Sotomayor believed that that's not the case because we need these voices that have a various amount of results. Whatever the reasons why we have different perspectives, either as some theorists suggest because of our cultural experience, or as more postulate because we have basic difference in logic and reasoning, are in many respects a small part of a larger practical question we as women and minority judges in society in general must address. So for the Paulette Brown interview, during her time as ABA president, she made consistent efforts to implement diversity and inclusion training for all judges, prosecutors, defenders, and attorneys within the civil litigation department. As a woman of color, she emphasizes the importance of diversity of thought because when you have a diverse group of people, especially when you have people of color, women members, and of the LGBT groups, they are able to resolve more complex issues in a way that a homogenous group is not able to do so. This goes back to how Justice Sotomayor believed that this is an asset instead of an impasse. When asked how law has changed for women of color in the past several years, her response was, I don't know if it's changed. Only about 2% rise to level of partnership. That is one of the things the commission is looking at, especially in terms of how women and women of color are treated from an economic standpoint. Goes back to, the differences between a woman white attorney and a woman of color attorney. Economic, steady career growth, how long they stay in the practice. So the conclusion, women of color are still facing staggering amounts of gender bias in the legal profession. The diversity inclusive efforts taken by the ABA and other law firms are not seen as enough until there's a personal sense of accountability amongst all parties. This includes support from white counterparts who are willing to stand up to racial inequality within the workplace. As a result, we cannot be considered an equitable society if the legal profession does not make the consistent effort to have a myriad of different voices within all positions within the field. So I believe that, as a society, not just as a woman of color, because even though I'm not going to the legal profession, I'm going into the law spectrum. And it's important for me for my voice to be heard and for all these women's voices to be heard who have worked extremely hard to get where they are. So as a society, we need to address that. Thank you. And please, any questions, and I apologize if I babbled on, please let me know if you have any questions. Thank you.